No one on Flight 2247 paid attention to the woman in Seat 12B. Then both engines failed at 32,000 feet. The cabin erupted in panic. The crew begged for any pilot on board. Silence. Then one woman quietly unbuckled her seatbelt and walked straight to the cockpit door. Sarah Chen sat quietly in Seat 12B, a cooking magazine open on her lap and a cup of black coffee cooling on the tray table in front of her. She wore faded blue jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and old sneakers. There was nothing about her that made anyone look twice. The man sitting next to her was on his laptop. The woman across the aisle was scrolling through her phone. Nobody paid any attention to the quiet woman in Seat 12B. Nobody knew that she had flown over 9,000 hours across 4 continents. Nobody knew she was one of the most decorated commercial pilots in the country. Nobody knew that in less than 40 minutes, every single person on that plane would be begging her to save their lives. Flight 2247 had departed Chicago O'Hare at 6:45 in the morning, heading to Los Angeles with 181 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The sky was clear and blue. The Boeing 737 climbed smoothly, leveling off at 32,000 feet somewhere over the flat middle of the country. It was the kind of flight that pilots and passengers both call routine. Nothing unusual. Nothing to worry about. Sarah had been a passenger on this flight for one simple reason. Her own aircraft, which she was scheduled to captain out of Los Angeles, had a maintenance delay. The airline had booked her on this commercial flight as the easiest solution. She had no duties today. No uniform. No ID badge clipped to her chest. She was just a tired woman in Seat 12B with a cooking magazine she was not really reading. She had been flying since she was 19 years old. She started on single-engine prop planes at a small airfield outside Sacramento, doing touch-and-go landings while her instructor told her she had natural hands. She worked her way up through regional carriers and turboprops and narrow-body jets, logging hours in every weather condition aviation could produce. She had flown through a hailstorm over Denver that turned the windscreen completely white. She had landed in a crosswind in Edinburgh so severe that her co-pilot grabbed his armrest and said nothing for a full minute afterward. She had handled single-engine emergencies more times than she could count. She had never, in 21 years of flying, lost both engines at once. Nobody had. That was not the kind of thing that happened. Except this morning, it was. She noticed things, though. She always noticed things. It was a habit she had built over 2 decades of flying, a kind of quiet awareness that never fully switched off, even when she was sitting in the back of a plane with a cup of coffee. She had noticed, about 20 minutes into the flight, that the engine tone on the left side had shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Most people would never catch it. But Sarah had spent thousands of hours listening to engines, and something in the back of her mind filed that small detail away without making a fuss about it. She turned a page in her magazine. She told herself it was nothing. The nervous man sitting 2 rows ahead of her was named Daniel. He was a sales manager from Milwaukee, flying to a meeting he had been dreading for weeks. He had already taken 2 antacid tablets from the small bottle in his jacket pocket. He kept tapping his knee. The young mother sitting across the aisle from Sarah had a baby on her lap, a little girl about 8 months old named Lily. Lily had been fussing quietly for most of the flight, and her mother, whose name was Rachel, looked exhausted in the way only new mothers look exhausted, deeply, completely, down to the bone. Flight attendant Maria had just finished her first round of the cabin when it happened. The sound was not something that can be described easily to someone who has never heard it. It was a bang, sharp and hard, followed immediately by a deep coughing vibration that rolled through the entire airframe. Then the left side of the aircraft went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The engine was gone. For about 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then the cabin erupted. People grabbed armrests. A woman in the back screamed. Daniel the sales manager knocked his water bottle off his tray. Baby Lily started crying loudly. The plane tilted slightly to the left before the autopilot corrected, and the overhead bins rattled with a sound that made everyone freeze all over again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm." It was the voice of the first officer through the intercom. His name was Officer James Kapoor, and to his credit, his voice was steady. "We have experienced a malfunction with our left engine. The aircraft is designed to fly on one engine and we are in no immediate danger. We are diverting to the nearest airport. Please keep your seatbelts fastened." Sarah had already closed her magazine. She was watching the wing out the window, checking the remaining engine visually. She could hear it working harder now, compensating for the loss. One engine was bad. One engine was manageable. She had trained for this. Every commercial pilot had trained for this. She was worried but not panicked. Then the right engine exploded. There was no other word for it. The second bang was louder than the first, a deep, chest-thumping detonation that shook the entire aircraft. The vibration lasted 4 or 5 seconds, then stopped completely. And then there was silence. A silence that was so total and so wrong that it was worse than any sound Sarah had ever heard in her life. Both engines were gone. At 32,000 feet. Over the middle of nowhere. With 181 passengers and 6 crew on board. The aircraft began to descend. Not falling. Not yet. But descending in the slow, heavy, inevitable way that a 155,000-pound aircraft descends when there is nothing pushing it forward and nothing keeping it up except physics and whatever altitude it had left in reserve. The wings were still generating lift. The controls still worked. But without engine power, every second was taking them closer to the ground. Maria the flight attendant grabbed the intercom handset from its cradle on the wall and pressed the button to reach the cockpit. "Captain Rodriguez, do you copy?" Her voice was tight but controlled. In the cockpit, Captain Luis Rodriguez was already running the dual-engine failure checklist with shaking hands. He had never seen both engines fail. Nobody had, not in a real aircraft, not for real, not with passengers. "We need help," Rodriguez said into the radio. "We need any help we can get." In the cockpit, Rodriguez and Kapoor were working through the emergency with the speed of men who had trained for this but had never truly believed it would happen. Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years. He had experienced one engine failure in his career, a partial compressor stall on a regional flight 6 years ago that had resolved itself within 40 seconds. This was different. This was both engines, silent, at cruise altitude, over empty farmland with no airport close enough to feel safe. His hands moved through the checklist with practiced speed, but his mind was doing something underneath the procedure. It was calculating odds, and the odds it was coming back with were not good. He did not say this out loud. He did not allow his voice to carry it. But he felt it, and Kapoor felt it too, and both men were working harder than they had ever worked in their lives. Maria did not think twice. She picked up the cabin intercom and her voice came over every speaker from first class to the last row. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious emergency. Both engines have failed. If there is a pilot on board, any pilot, with any experience, please come to the front of the aircraft immediately. Please come forward now." The cabin was silent for a moment. Then the people near seat 12B watched as the quiet woman in the white t-shirt unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, stepped calmly into the aisle, and walked toward the front of the plane. She did not run. She did not look afraid. She walked with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who had already made a decision and was not going back. The passengers she passed were in different states of fear. Some were gripping their armrests with both hands, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the seat in front of them. Some were crying silently. One older gentleman in a gray suit was holding a rosary and moving his lips. A teenage boy near the window had his face pressed to the glass, staring at the ground far below as if he could not believe it was real. A woman in business class had her phone out and was recording a video message to someone she loved, speaking in a low, urgent voice that Sarah could not make out as she passed. Sarah did not stop for any of them. She could not help them yet. The only way to help them was to keep walking. She passed Maria without breaking stride. "I am going to the cockpit," she said simply. Maria met her at the cockpit door. "Are you a pilot?" she asked. "My name is Captain Sarah Chen," Sarah said. "I have 9,200 flight hours including 4,100 on this exact aircraft type. You need to open that door." Maria opened the door. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez turned and looked at the woman standing in the doorway in jeans and a white t-shirt. For one moment, everything in him wanted to say no. She had no uniform. She had no badge. She was a stranger who had walked up from seat 12B. But the instruments in front of him told a story that was impossible to argue with. Both engines were offline. The aircraft was descending at 400 feet per minute. The ground was getting closer with every breath he took. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the right-hand seat. Sarah sat down. She pulled the harness straps over her shoulders and clipped them in with the mechanical speed of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She put her hands on the controls and took one breath. "Talk to me," she said. "What do we have?" Rodriguez read off the instruments. "Both engines out. We are at 29,400 feet descending. Airspeed 260 knots. APU is online. We have hydraulics, controls, and electrical. No fire. No structural damage that I can see. Best glide speed for this aircraft is 250 knots, Sarah said. Pitch up slightly, there. Hold that. We want to stretch every foot of altitude as far as it will take us." She scanned the instruments with the practiced speed of a pilot reading a story she already knew. "What is our nearest airport?" Officer Kapoor was already on the radio with air traffic control in Kansas City. "Nearest suitable runway is Wichita, 58 miles northeast," he said. "Denver is 91 miles. There are two smaller strips within 40 miles but neither can handle a 737 landing weight." Sarah ran the math in her head. A 737 glides at roughly 1 mile for every 17 feet of altitude it loses. At 29,000 feet, that gave them approximately 93 nautical miles of glide range, but that was a perfect calculation under perfect conditions. They had wind to consider. They had altitude loss during any maneuvering. They had the weight of 181 passengers and whatever fuel remained in the tanks. She thought about every dual-engine failure scenario she had ever run in the simulator. She had done it dozens of times over the years, always in a controlled environment, always with an instructor beside her and a reset button available if things went wrong. There was no reset button now. There was no instructor. There was just the aircraft and the ground and the shrinking distance between them, and 181 people in the cabin behind her who did not know yet how close the margins truly were. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands steady. That was the job. "Wichita is possible," she said. "Barely. But we have zero margin for error." She looked at Rodriguez. "We need to get lighter." He understood immediately. "Kapoor, get Maria on the intercom. Full passenger briefing. Emergency brace position preparation. And we need to dump everything heavy that we can." Sarah took the intercom herself. Her voice, when it came over the speakers, was calm and clear and carried no panic. In the cabin, every passenger heard her words and something in those words, the steadiness of them, pulled people back from the edge of complete fear. "This is Captain Sarah Chen speaking. I am a commercial airline pilot and I am flying this aircraft. We have lost both engines and we are gliding toward Wichita Airport, which we can reach safely if we work together. I need your help right now." Flight attendants, please move all passengers to the rear of the aircraft to redistribute weight. Move carry-on bags to the floor immediately. Follow every instruction from the crew without delay. We have approximately 19 minutes. We are going to land this plane. In the cabin, something shifted. The screaming stopped. The crying did not stop. Baby Lily was still wailing and several adults were crying openly, but the random, spinning panic of the previous minutes began to organize itself into something more focused. Maria and the other flight attendants moved through the cabin with authority. Passengers slid out of seats and moved rearward. Bags were shoved under seats and onto laps. Daniel, the sales manager, who had been white-knuckling his armrest since the first explosion, found himself helping an elderly couple move their carry-ons without quite knowing when he had decided to do that. In the cockpit, Sarah was working through every option she had. ATC was feeding her information every 30 seconds. Wind at surface level was light. Temperature was normal. No terrain obstacles in their glide path. Kansas was flat in every direction, and that flatness, which would have seemed boring from a passenger seat, was right now the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever looked at from a cockpit. Flat meant options. Flat meant that if the highway did not work, there were fields, long, open, harvested fields with soil soft enough to absorb a gear-up landing if it came to that. She did not want it to come to that. A gear-up landing in a field with 181 people on board was survivable, but it was not clean, and she was going to pursue every cleaner option first. The highway was cleaner. The highway was the plan. The glide was holding. The wings were level. The airspeed was sitting at 252 knots, close enough to optimal that she could live with it. But 58 miles was a long way with no engine and a descending aircraft, and the math was getting tighter with every minute. At 22,000 feet, air traffic control came back with news that changed the calculation. A major weather system had pushed into the Wichita area in the last hour. Crosswind at the runway was 34 knots, gusting to 42. For a normal powered landing, it would be difficult but manageable. For an unpowered glide landing with no ability to make a second approach, it was close to impossible. "We cannot land in Wichita," Sarah said quietly. She did not say it with panic. She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, clearly, without softening, because the person receiving the information needed to understand it fully. "Then where?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah was already scanning the navigation display. She had been watching the ground through the windscreen at the same time, the flat Kansas landscape stretching out below them in every direction. And then she saw it, a long, straight, empty line running northeast to southwest through the farmland below. A state highway. 4 lanes. Flat and straight for at least 3 miles from what she could see. "Highway," she said. Rodriguez looked at her. "You want to put a 737 on a highway." "I want to put 181 people on the ground alive," she said. "That highway is 3 miles of clear pavement with no overpasses in the section I can see. We have no crosswind problem because we can align with it directly. We have flat farmland on both sides if we need to go off the edge." She looked at him. "It has been done before." He knew she was right. In 1983, a Canadian aircraft called the Gimli Glider had run out of fuel and landed on a racing strip. Captain Sullenberger had put U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in the Hudson River. Unpowered emergency landings were not unheard of. They were not easy. But they were possible. Rodriguez stared at the highway on the navigation display for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. It was not a confident nod. It was the nod of a man who understood that he had run out of better options and was choosing to trust the woman sitting next to him completely. "You have the aircraft," he said formally. "I have the aircraft," Sarah confirmed. It was a small exchange. 6 words total. But in aviation, those 6 words carry the full weight of command and responsibility. From that moment, Flight 2247 belonged to Captain Sarah Chen. Kapoor, Sarah said, get the highway on the charts and give me exact coordinates. I need ATC to check for traffic. We need police and emergency vehicles moving to that location right now. Kapoor was already on the radio before she finished speaking. At 14,000 feet, Sarah briefed the cabin again. Her voice was the same, level, clear, carrying weight without conveying fear. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to land on a state highway below us rather than the airport. The highway is clear of traffic and is long enough for our aircraft. Emergency vehicles are being positioned now. This is not a crash landing, this is a controlled landing on an alternative runway. Assume full brace position on the count of my crew. Keep your seatbelts on. Keep your heads down. We will be on the ground in approximately 8 minutes. In the cabin, Rachel pulled baby Lily tight against her chest and curled forward. She pressed her lips to her daughter's head and closed her eyes. Daniel, the sales manager, closed his eyes and held the armrests so hard that his knuckles went white and stayed white. The elderly couple in row 24 held each other's hands and did not let go. The teenage boy who had been staring out the window pressed himself back into his seat and pulled his knees up. The woman who had been recording a video message finished it, pressed send, and then put her phone face down on her lap and folded her hands on top of it. Maria and her crew moved through the cabin one final time, checking harnesses, checking brace positions, speaking quietly to passengers who looked close to losing their composure. One man in row 18 was shaking so badly he could not buckle his own seatbelt. A flight attendant named Grace buckled it for him and held his hand for 3 seconds before moving on. Nobody in the cabin spoke above a whisper. The only sounds were the rush of air past the windows, the soft crying of baby Lily, and the faint creak of the aircraft as it descended through the sky on nothing but wings and physics and the steady hands of the woman in the cockpit. In the cockpit, Sarah flew. At 8,000 feet she began the alignment. The highway was clearly visible now, a gray ribbon across the farmland, running almost perfectly straight in the direction she needed. ATC confirmed it had been cleared. State police had blocked access at both ends within minutes of the call going out. There were no vehicles. No obstacles. 3 miles of open pavement. Landing checklist, she said. Rodriguez ran it with her. Gear down, they had hydraulic pressure, the gear came down and locked with 3 satisfying thumps. Flaps to approach setting. Cabin pressurization check. Emergency lighting on. At 4,000 feet the highway was directly ahead of them. At 2,000 feet Sarah made her final adjustment to alignment, correcting 2 degrees to the left. The aircraft was heavy and slow and responding with the sluggishness of a glider that was using up the last of its options. She had one shot. There was no go around. If she got it wrong, there was no second chance. She did not get it wrong. At 1,000 feet she called "brace" into the intercom and her voice was steady as stone. In the cabin behind her, 181 people bent forward over their own laps. At 500 feet the highway filled the windscreen from side to side. At 200 feet she called the descent rate, good, holding, and Rodriguez, watching the altimeter, called out the numbers. 150 feet. 100 feet. 75 feet. 50 feet. Sarah pulled back on the yoke gently, bleeding off the last of their speed, and the main landing gear touched the highway with a hard double thump that sent a shock through the entire aircraft. She pushed the nose down, let the nose wheel contact the surface, and immediately applied full wheel braking. Without reverse thrust from the engines, they were relying entirely on brakes and friction and whatever runway, whatever highway, they had left in front of them. The aircraft decelerated hard. Passengers lurched forward against their seatbelts. The wings rocked slightly but stayed level. The tires screamed against the asphalt. The aircraft shook and shuddered and kept slowing, slower and slower and slower, and then, 2,200 feet from where the main gear had touched down, it stopped. Completely stopped. On a highway in Kansas. In the cockpit, for exactly 4 seconds, nobody spoke. Rodriguez had both hands flat on the instrument panel in front of him, not gripping anything, just resting there, as if he needed to feel something solid and real. Kapoor had his eyes closed. The instruments in front of them were reading values they had never read on a landed aircraft: no engine RPM, no thrust, no fuel flow, just silence where numbers usually lived. Outside the windscreen, the Kansas farmland stretched away on both sides of the highway, brown and flat and absolutely still in the early morning light. A crow sat on a fence post about 30 yards to the right and looked at the aircraft with what appeared to be mild curiosity. Rodriguez noticed the crow. He did not know why he noticed it. He supposed it was just that his mind needed something ordinary to hold onto for 1 second. For a moment there was total silence inside the aircraft. Then the cabin exploded into sound, crying, cheering, people calling out names, someone saying, "Thank God," over and over, someone else laughing in a high, broken way that was more relief than joy. Baby Lily was crying and then, strangely, laughing. Rachel was holding her so tight she could barely breathe, tears streaming down her face. Daniel the sales manager put his face in his hands and shook for a full 30 seconds before he could stop. Maria got on the intercom. "Remain seated with seatbelts fastened until we give the all clear. Emergency vehicles are on their way. Everyone is okay. We are on the ground." In the cockpit, Sarah Chen sat back in the right-hand seat and let out one long, slow breath. Rodriguez was staring at her. He had not fully processed what had just happened, and from the look on his face, it was going to take him a while. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Sarah almost smiled. "Seat 12B, she said. The evacuation went smoothly. Emergency vehicles reached them within 6 minutes, police cars and fire trucks and ambulances lined up on the highway shoulder, lights flashing. The slides deployed and passengers descended in orderly lines, some walking, some being helped, all of them alive. Rachel carried baby Lily down the slide and sat on the grass at the roadside and did not move for a long time. The highway itself was a strange sight. A Boeing 737 sitting on 4 lanes of Kansas asphalt, surrounded by cornfields, with emergency lights flashing in every direction and 181 people standing in the grass on both sides looking at the aircraft that had just carried them from 32,000 feet to the ground without a single engine running. Some of them were on their phones. Some were sitting in the grass with their knees pulled up. Some were just standing very still, looking at nothing, processing something that their minds had not yet found the right category for. Daniel found Maria as the last passengers were evacuating and said something that he immediately felt was completely inadequate. "Thank you," he said. "That's not enough, but I don't know what else to say." Maria shook her head. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank the woman in 12B. The investigation that followed took 11 months. The NTSB determined that a manufacturing defect in a shared fuel line component had caused a cascade failure that resulted in the simultaneous flame-out of both engines, an event with a calculated probability so small it had no official name. Captain Rodriguez was cleared of all wrongdoing. Officer Kapoor received a commendation for his radio coordination work. The 181 passengers all went home to their families. And Captain Sarah Chen, who had been on her way to catch a connecting flight in seat 12B, received the FAA's highest safety award at a ceremony 7 months later. She stood at the podium in her full captain's uniform and looked out at the room full of people who had come to see her, and she said something that was later repeated in articles and interviews and aviation training programs for years afterward. "Every flight I ever made prepared me for that one," she said. "Every hour, every approach, every simulator session, every checklist. It all went into that 19 minutes. That is what training is for. Not for the normal days. For the one day that isn't normal." She paused. "Also," she said, "I would like it noted that I never got to finish my coffee." The room laughed. And somewhere in the audience, Daniel the sales manager laughed too, and Rachel, who was there with baby Lily on her lap, laughed and then cried a little, in the way people do when they remember that they are very, very lucky to be alive. After the ceremony, Sarah stood outside in the parking lot for a few minutes by herself. The evening was cool and clear. She could see aircraft lights blinking in the dark sky above the city, red and white, moving in slow arcs toward the airport on the other side of town. She watched them for a while. She thought about all the people sitting in those aircraft right now, reading magazines, sleeping, watching movies, holding babies, worrying about meetings. They had no idea who was flying them. They had no idea what training looked like from the inside, what it felt like to have 10,000 hours of preparation compress itself into a single moment of absolute necessity. They did not need to know. That was not their job. Their job was to trust. Her job was to be worthy of that trust, every single flight, whether anything went wrong or not. She went back inside. There was still cake. Back in the air, in cockpits around the world, pilots who heard the story of Flight 2247 nodded at the same detail. The woman in seat 12B had heard the engine change before the instruments caught it. She had noticed. She had filed it away. She had been ready before anyone knew that ready would be required. That is not luck. That is not a miracle. That is what it means to be a pilot, even when you are sitting in seat 12B, reading a cooking magazine, with a cup of black coffee going cold on the tray table. You are always flying.